Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 9 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at the nature of emotionally intelligent leadership.
In session 9 we're going to look at the idea of becoming an emotionally intelligent leader. We're going to build on the work of Daniel Goleman and tackle an issue that really is leading edge thinking on effective leadership. In slide 2 we're going to look at the issue of leadership and emotional intelligence. We're going to look at Daniel Goleman's research, leadership and emotion, how that links with organisational climate, and talk a little bit about styles of leadership and what seems to work best, particularly in a day-to-day operational environment. Well, one of the ideas mentioned in session 1 about our development of thought on leadership was the idea of emotionally intelligent leadership. And this area of leadership development was triggered by Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence, which was first published in 1995. Goleman is both a psychologist and a journalist who became fascinated by the idea that human beings often operate in a way that almost totally lacks emotional intelligence, and in fact ways that tend to harm other human beings, often physically as well as mentally. In his article, What Makes a Leader, published in the Harvard Business Review in 1998, he proposed 5 aspects of emotional intelligence and asserts that unlike intellectual intelligence, emotional intelligence may be developed. He assessed the competence frameworks of a number of major organisations, including Lucent Technologies, British Airways and Credit Suisse, to see which capabilities actually drove performance. He grouped the competencies into 3 categories: technical skills, thinking or cognitive skills such as analytical reasoning, and competencies displaying emotional intelligence such as working with others and effective change leadership. He found that the emotional intelligence skills played an increasingly important role, particularly at the higher levels in organisations, and we'll explore the 5 areas of emotional intelligence in the next slide. But before moving on, we'll mention that one of Goleman's great contributions to thinking on leadership, particularly at the operational level, is the relationship between leadership style and the impact on climate or atmosphere within the organisation. We'll explore these styles which are emotionally intelligent and produce the best results in day-to-day operations. So the study questions before you move on to the next slide are as follows. Where would you place your major skills? In the technical, the thinking, or the emotionally intelligent areas? Do you think emotional intelligence skill can be developed? Just give some thought to those before moving on. Slide 2 shows the most important 5 areas of emotional intelligence as defined by Daniel Goleman: emotional self-awareness, self-regulation and self-management, harnessing emotions productively, which is the essence of motivation, then empathy and reading emotions in others, and finally handling relationships and social skills. Now Goleman points to the importance of self-awareness, and in the spirit of the Delphic oracle, know thyself, is as important today as it was first mentioned thousands of years ago. Self-awareness means having a good deep understanding of one's emotions, strengths, needs, drives and areas for development. People who have a high degree of self-awareness are neither overtly critical nor unrealistically hopeful. They tend to be balanced. They recognize how feelings affect them, and they have a keen understanding of their values and goals. Now the second area is self-regulation and self-management, being able to control emotional states rather than having them under unconscious biological control. Now although the individual may feel upset in a situation, they can control their emotions so that they remain logical and in control. Goleman claims that self-regulation is as important as leadership itself is, as it enhances integrity and to a considerable degree credibility. The third area in Goleman's original thinking is that of motivation, being able to harness emotions effectively to motivate yourself and others. This is of course extremely important for the leader, who may have to overcome negative states in themselves and others and look for ways to stimulate motivation. The fourth area is that of empathy, preferably tough empathy, and the ability to read others' emotions. The American Indians have an expression, "walk a mile in another person's moccasins," and this sums up the nature of empathy. Can you see the world through another person's eyes? However, empathy must not be confused with sympathy or feeling sorry for people. It is helpful to use the expression tough empathy to avoid this trap, as what we're trying to achieve is an objective sense of the other person's thoughts, feelings and behaviors, rather than feeling emotionally affected by them. The fifth and final element of Goleman's original thinking on emotional intelligence is to point to the importance of handling relationships well and having effective social skills. Taken together, these 5 areas provide a sound understanding of the territory of emotional intelligence. So let's give some thought to the study questions. At which of Goleman's 5 areas of emotional intelligence are you strongest? Just look at the slide to remind you what those 5 areas are. Which is your least developed area of the 5? Just spend some time thinking about that, working with the slide, and then we'll move on to the next slide when you've reflected on these 5 key areas of emotional intelligence. In slide 4, we move on to explore Goleman's article, Leadership That Gets Results. This compresses the 5 aspects of emotional intelligence we've already talked about into 4 leadership issues. It talks about the basis of leadership style and the basis of organizational climate. Well, this article represents one of the major contributions that Goleman made to leadership thinking, and it's a study he carried out with consultants Hay McBurr, which set out to explore the impact of 6 leadership styles on organizational climate. The sample set was with 3,781 executives selected from a database of more than 20,000 executives worldwide in an attempt to demystify the nature of effective leadership. The 5 core elements of emotional intelligence were compressed into 4 areas by assigning the motivation element to the first 2 elements, which were aimed at the leader, and then the third and fourth elements, which were then aimed at the led. 6 styles of leadership were proposed, and these are discussed in more detail together with the effects they produce in the next slide. They were vision-based leadership, what Goleman actually calls authoritative leadership. It was also affiliative leadership that was mentioned, democratic leadership, coaching leadership, coercion, and pace setting. There were 6 elements of organizational climate, and these were flexibility, sense of responsibility, performing to high standards, contentment with rewards, clarity of purpose, and a sense of commitment. So your study questions are these. Do you think Goleman was correct in terms of condensing his original 5 elements of emotional intelligence into the 4 areas used in the study? Can you identify any additional styles of leadership to the 6 on which the study was based? What is your view on the appropriateness of the 6 organizational climate elements? Looking at slide 5, we can see this idea of linking leadership style and emotion, the basis of Goleman's article, Leadership That Gets Results. It's interesting to review the 6 leadership styles in terms of the nature of each style. Firstly, in the study, Goleman does not use the term vision-based, but instead calls this style authoritative. Now, at first sight, this might seem appropriate, but on reflection, when the nature of the style is discussed in the Harvard Business Review article, it is clearly about vision. Quote, mobilizing the people towards a vision, end of quote. And it's used best when a new vision is needed or clear direction. Therefore, it's felt more appropriate for our purposes to call this style vision-based rather than authoritative, as the use of the word vision seems to sum up the style more effectively. Now, the democratic style is about inclusion, collaboration and producing consensus and team working. The affiliative style is about producing good relationships in the organisation, particularly in cross-functional terms. The emphasis is on team working, empathy, relationship development and communication. The coaching style is about unlocking human potential and developing people through their own work experience. The coercive style is about demanding compliance. It reflects a strong task orientation rather than a people orientation, and it has its main application in crisis and critical situations rather than in day-to-day normal life. Finally, the pace-setting style is where the leader seems to set out to display that she or he is better than the led at the work in hand, and it's all about setting high standards. As such, it tends to have its application with a high-performing team. So, the study questions we'd like you to think about are these. To what extent do you use these 6 styles? Are you limited to just one or two of the styles? Are there any other situations, in your view, other than critical ones, where coercive and pace-setting leadership can have an effective role to play? Let's give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. Moving on to slide 6, let's now think of Goleman's results and look at the impact of leadership style on organisational climate. Now, the most positive impact comes from vision-based leadership, authoritative in Goleman's language, and the second most positive style is the affiliative style. Third in the rank of positive effect is the democratic style, and number 4 is the coaching style. These are the 4 positive styles of leadership that seem to produce a positive impact on the organisational climate, the atmosphere, if you like. Now, the surprising result of this study is that the 2 traditional command and control styles of leadership, the coercive and the pace-setting, seem to produce a negative impact on climate. And we can probably explain this by considering that Goleman's study was about day-to-day leadership situations, not critical incidents or crises. Both coercive and pace-setting styles can have an important part to play in handling difficult situations. The lesson here is that leaders need a range of styles, and to use the metaphor in the original article, it's akin to using the appropriate golf club for different situations, such as driving or getting out of a bunker or putting. And as with his earlier article, Goleman points to the idea that emotional intelligence can be developed, unlike intellectual intelligence. Therefore, emotionally intelligent leadership can be developed. So the study questions for this particular slide are these. Do you think that if a leader keeps changing leadership style, that there is a risk that she or he may be seen to be inconsistent? What is the key to avoiding that impression of inconsistent leadership? Give some thought to these 2 questions before moving on to the next slide. Moving on to slide 7, emotionally intelligent leadership is seen very much as a positive aspect of leadership, but there is a dark side of leadership. Beware the toxic leader. Now, this is an issue which has emerged in recent years, and the perils of toxic leadership are endemic in many organisations, particularly in tough times. Toxic leaders are those individuals who, by virtue of their destructive behaviours and their dysfunctional personal qualities or characteristics, inflict serious and enduring harm on the individuals, groups and organisations, communities and even the nations that they lead. And such leaders still appear in public, private and third sector organisations, particularly in political leadership positions. Now, the article quoted in the bibliography by Jean Lippmann-Blumen gives a good account of why we tolerate toxic leaders. Maybe it's because we have a need for authority figures. That's one of the issues that's often quoted. Lippmann-Blumen develops a useful approach to handling toxic leaders, one of the key elements being that the toxic leader needs to be challenged by a group of people rather than an individual, and that evidence of their toxic behaviour, both past and present, needs to be collated if their impact is to be reduced. So before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the study questions. Have you encountered any toxic leaders in the various job roles you've held? If so, what were the effects that they produced? And how did you handle their behaviour? Let's give some thoughts to those questions, reflect on them before moving on to the next slide. So let's think how we can avoid toxic leadership. People often become toxic in order to achieve things, and they like to see that tasks are completed on schedule. However, the consensus of opinion seems to be that the toxic approach may work temporarily in the short term, but that it causes major problems in the long term. The book Leadership by Richard Daft contains much useful material on emotionally intelligent leadership which will help combat and remove the impact of toxic leadership. So, your study questions are these. Can you identify any toxic leaders with whom you currently have to work in your organisation? If so, can you identify ways of minimising their negative impact on the organisation? Give some thought to those two questions before moving on to the final slide, which is the bibliography for this session. Now, in the bibliography for session 9, we have a number of very useful texts and articles. Firstly, Daniel Goleman's original book Emotional Intelligence, published in 1996, is a very useful foundation text, and this is developed beautifully in Working with Emotional Intelligence, published 2 years later in 1998. The two Harvard Business Review articles, firstly What Makes a Leader, published in 1998, and then Leadership That Gets Results, published in 2000, are both very clearly written and very well worth reading to get an insight of what emotional intelligence means in terms of leadership. Jean Lippmann-Blumen's article, The Allure of Toxic Leadership, the Ivy Business Journal, January to February 2005. It's easily available on the internet if you do a Google search. And finally, once again, a reminder that Richard Daft's book Leadership is a very, very useful source text. So that's the end of session 9. I look forward to speaking with you in the final session of this particular set of Leadership in Action studies, and that is session 10. Thank you.